April 7, 1945, 12:30 p.m. The East China Sea is restless, its gray waves concealing the final moments of a naval era. Deep within the steel bowels of the largest battleship ever constructed, the vibrations of four massive propeller shafts are felt more than they are heard. For the 3,000 men aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy flagship Yamato, the world has shrunk to the size of their battle stations. They know this is a suicide mission, Operation 10 Go. There is no air cover, no hope of return, and no tactical objective other than a desperate one-way charge toward Okinawa. The mission is simple and devastating. Reach the island, beach the ship, and act as a shore battery until every shell is spent and every man is dead. But the era of the battleship would not end with a whimper or a formal retirement. It was about to end in a 30-minute paroxysm of fire, steel, and gravity. To understand the magnitude of this loss, we must look beyond the broad strokes of history and examine the technical failures, the tactical decisions of Vice Admiral Seiichi Itō, and the precise moment the pride of the IJN became a funeral pyre. The radar screens on the Yamato had been glowing with ominous blips for nearly an hour before the first shot was fired. The American Big Blue Blanket was descending, as Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher had launched over 280 aircraft from the carriers of Task Force 58. Helldivers, Avengers, and Hellcats formed a swarm of mechanical hornets designed for one purpose: to kill the beast. At exactly 12:32 p.m., the first wave made contact. For the American pilots, the Yamato was a terrifying sight, displacing over 72,000 tons with a main belt of 16-inch Vickers hardened steel. However, the ship possessed a fatal flaw. Her anti-aircraft suite, while visually intimidating with dozens of 25mm Type 96 triple mounts, was technologically outdated. The guns lacked the tracking speed and advanced fire control necessary to keep up with fast-moving American dive bombers. The first hits were almost instantaneous. Two 1,000-pound bombs struck the aft deck near the mainmast, shredding the secondary battery fire control and igniting a fire in the upper structures that would never be extinguished. Inside the ship, the crew felt a bone-deep racking of the hull, the shudder of a direct hit. At 12:41 p.m., the first torpedo found its mark, striking the port side near the bow. To the men in the engine rooms, it sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil the size of a mountain. By 12:45 p.m., the Yamato was no longer the hunter. She was a target being systematically dismantled. U.S. Navy pilots employed a brutal, calculated tactic. They focused their attacks almost exclusively on the port side. By concentrating damage on one side of the hull, they ensured that flooding would not be balanced. As the Yamato began to tilt, her heavy armor belt, designed to absorb impact to the waterline, rose out of the sea, exposing the unarmored belly of the ship to subsequent torpedo runs. By 1 p.m., the ship was listing 5 degrees to port. On a vessel of this scale, such a list meant the decks were slanted, the ammunition hoists were straining, and the gunners were forced to fight gravity just to keep their sights on the horizon. The American pilots from a Hornet and Hancock were now lining up for the kill, and the Yamato's final 30 minutes had truly begun. As the clock struck 1 p.m., the situation aboard the Yamato transitioned from a managed crisis to a chaotic struggle for survival. The second wave of American aircraft, comprising nearly 100 planes from the carriers Essex and Bataan, arrived with ferocity that overwhelmed the remaining Japanese escorts. The light cruiser Yahagi had already been crippled, taking a torpedo directly into her engine room, which left the Yamato essentially alone in a sea of predators. Inside the battleship's damage control center, the atmosphere was frantic. Captain Aruga ordered immediate counterflooding to correct the 5-degree list. This was a desperate move. To level the ship, they had to intentionally flood the starboard engine and boiler rooms. This meant that the very men working to keep the ship moving were sacrificed, drowned by their own side to keep the great guns level. Despite these sacrifices, the list only temporarily stabilized. The sheer volume of water entering the port side from at least 3 confirmed torpedo hits was outpacing the pumps and the manual efforts of the damage control teams. By 1:15 p.m., the sky over the Yamato was a chaotic tapestry of flak bursts and tracer fire. The American pilots had noticed the ship's increasing sluggishness and narrowed their focus. They began hammering the pivot, targeting the rudder and the screws to strip the giant of its maneuverability. A torpedo strike near the stern jammed the auxiliary rudder in a hard-over position, forcing the Yamato into a wide, agonizingly slow circle to port. This made the ship an even easier target for the dive bombers of the Yorktown Air Group. The heat from the fires on the upper decks was now so intense that it began to cook off the 25mm ammunition stored in ready-use lockers, creating secondary explosions that swept across the superstructure. Men were being blown overboard by the concussive force of their own exploding ordnance, and the once pristine teak decks were slick with oil, blood, and seawater. As the third and final wave of aircraft from the Intrepid and Yorktown began their runs at 1:20 p.m., the structural integrity of the Yamato reached its breaking point. The ship was now listing 15 degrees to port, a critical angle that rendered the massive 18.1-inch main turrets useless. The hydraulic systems, damaged by the constant jarring of near misses and direct hits, could no longer rotate the 2,500-ton turrets against the incline of the ship. The great guns, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were now nothing more than dead weight, pulling the ship further into the abyss. Below decks, the communication lines were severed. The bridge was losing contact with the engine rooms, and reports were coming in that the bow was beginning to settle dangerously low in the water. The internal bulkheads, designed to withstand the pressure of the deep, were buckling under the weight of thousands of tons of Pacific seawater. The final 10 minutes of the ship's life were a descent into a mechanical and human inferno. By 1:33 p.m., the list had increased to 20 degrees. The order was finally given to abandon ship, but for many of the crew trapped in the lower compartments, the order came too late. The ladders were now nearly horizontal, and the oil-slick floors made climbing toward the deck an impossible task. Vice Admiral Itō, realizing the end had come, retreated to his cabin to go down with the ship, while Captain Aruga lashed himself to the binnacle to ensure he stayed with his command. At 1:41 p.m., the ship's list reached 35 degrees. The massive 18.1-inch shells in the magazines, weighing nearly 3,200 pounds each, began to slide out of their racks. This shift in internal weight was a final catalyst. As the Yamato rolled further, the highly volatile ammunition for the secondary batteries and the massive main shells tumbled together, sparking a chain reaction that would result in one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. At 2:20 p.m., the Yamato reached a point of no return. The ship was heeled over at such an extreme angle that the port side deck edge was completely submerged, and the massive weight of the ship was no longer being supported by buoyancy, but was instead being pulled down by the sheer mass of the water entering her hull. As the ship rolled past 80 degrees, the great 18.1-inch turrets, which were not actually bolted to the ship but held in place by their own immense weight, slipped from their roller paths. These 2,500-ton steel structures fell away from the hull, crashing into the sea and creating massive vacuums that sucked nearby sailors into the depths. The captain's final order to abandon ship was drowned out by the roar of the ocean rushing into the funnels and the screeching of metal as the internal superstructures began to collapse under the lateral strain. As the battleship capsized completely, the true catastrophe occurred. Deep within the hull, the shift in gravity caused thousands of rounds of 18.1-inch ammunition and secondary 6.1-inch shells to tumble from their storage racks. At 2:23 p.m., as the Yamato turned turtle and her bridge disappeared beneath the waves, a massive fire in the aft secondary magazine reached the main ammunition stores. The resulting explosion was tectonic. A pillar of fire and smoke erupted from the seabed, blasting through the surface of the ocean and rising over 6,000 feet into the air. The explosion was so powerful that it was seen 125 miles away in Kagoshima, and the resulting mushroom cloud was reportedly visible from the shores of Kyushu. For the American pilots circling above, the shock wave was felt even at an altitude of several thousand feet, buffeting their aircraft like leaves in a storm. The explosion didn't just destroy the ship, it vaporized a significant portion of the midsection. The Yamato was literally torn in two. The bow section, severed by the force of the blast, sank relatively intact, while the stern section was shattered into a field of debris. Of the 3,332 crew members on board, only 276 survived. The rest were either killed in initial air attacks, drowned in the rapid capsize, or consumed by the massive underwater explosion. The sinking of the Yamato was not just the loss of the ship. It was a final, violent punctuation mark at the end of the battleship era. The world's largest guns and thickest armor had proven no match for the reach and precision of carrier-based aviation. The aftermath left the Imperial Japanese Navy a ghost of its former self. With the Yamato gone, the decisive battle doctrine that had guided Japanese naval thinking for decades was revealed to be a tragic fantasy. Today, the wreck of the Yamato lies 1,120 feet below the surface of the East China Sea, split into two large pieces, and surrounded by a vast debris field of shells, 25mm gun mounts, and personal effects. It serves as a haunting monument to the peak of naval engineering and the futility of the mission it was sent to complete. The unsinkable fortress had lasted less than 2 hours under concentrated aerial assault, proving that in the new age of warfare, steel was no longer a substitute for air superiority. To reach the depth of detail required for a definitive account, we must analyze the minute-by-minute mechanical degradation of the ship and the specific tactical maneuvers of the American air groups. By 1:45 p.m., the Yamato was no longer functioning as a cohesive weapon system. The loss of the secondary battery fire control early in the engagement meant that the ship's primary defense against the low-flying TBM Avengers was reduced to manual sighting. In the chaos of the smoke and the spray from near misses, the Japanese gunners were firing blindly into the mist. The American pilots of Air Group 82, launched from the USS Bennington, reported that the Yamato's anti-aircraft fire was erratic and frantic, often exploding too high or too low to catch the coordinated dives of the Helldivers. This mechanical disconnect was the beginning of the end. At 1:50 p.m., a critical hit occurred that history often overlooks in favor of the final explosion. A spread of torpedoes from the USS Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 17 struck the port quarter. This hit was devastating because it damaged the outer propeller shaft and the steering gear room simultaneously. The Yamato was designed with a dual rudder system, a main rudder and a smaller auxiliary rudder, intended to provide redundancy. However, the concussive force of these hits jammed the auxiliary rudder at a 15-degree angle. The ship began to crab through the water, losing the ability to maintain a straight course. For a battleship of this size, losing maneuverability while under aerial assault is a death sentence. It allowed the American dive bombers to line up their runs with mathematical precision, dropping 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs directly onto the weakened midships area. Below the waterline, the situation was even more dire. The counter-flooding measures ordered by Captain Aruga were a double-edged sword. While they briefly corrected the list, they also reduced the ship's reserve buoyancy to a razor-thin margin. By flooding the starboard engine rooms to balance the hits on the port side, the crew had essentially turned the ship into a sinking weight. The water was no longer just in the outer voids. It was in the heart of the machinery. Steam pressure began to drop as the remaining boilers were overwhelmed by the influx of cold seawater. The lights throughout the ship flickered and died, plunging the damage control teams into a suffocating darkness filled with the smell of fuel oil and the sound of groaning steel. Men used hand-cranked torches to navigate the labyrinthine corridors, trying to shore up bulkheads that were already bulging inward. At 2:05 p.m., the fourth and most coordinated wave of the afternoon began. This wave was led by the USS Yorktown's Air Group 9. They approached the Yamato from the stern, a tactic designed to exploit the ship's inability to bring its heavy forward guns to bear. As the Avengers dropped to less than 200 feet above the water, they released their torpedoes at point-blank range. 3 more torpedoes slammed into the port side in rapid succession. The impact was so great that it actually lifted the 72,000-ton vessel slightly out of the water before it settled back down, now listing 22 degrees. At this angle, the over-the-side discharge valves of the pumps were submerged, meaning the ship could no longer pump water out. It could only take more in. The human element of the disaster was equally harrowing. In the final 15 minutes, the communication between the bridge and the rest of the ship was completely severed. Vice Admiral Itō sat in his chair on the bridge, silent, having accepted the failure of the mission. On the deck, the midshipmen and gunners were being swept away by the sheer force of the water as the waves began to crest over the port railing. The ship's surgeon reported that the infirmary, located deep in the hull, was already underwater, and hundreds of wounded men were trapped behind jammed watertight doors. The impenetrable fortress had become a steel trap. The structural integrity of the hull was failing. The longitudinal girders, the very spine of the Yamato, were snapping under the uneven weight of the flooding. By 2:15 p.m., the Yamato was dying a visible death. The ship had slowed to a mere 7 knots. The American aircraft, having exhausted their torpedoes and heavy bombs, began strafing the decks with .50 caliber machine guns to prevent any remaining crew from launching life rafts. The list reached 30 degrees. At this point, the massive 18.1-inch shells, each weighing as much as a small car, began to break free from their cradles in the magazines. These shells were stored vertically, and as the ship tilted, the centrifugal force and gravity combined to snap the locking pins. The sound of thousands of tons of ordnance shifting inside the hull was described by survivors as a low, grinding roar that could be heard even over the sound of the planes. The final transition from ship to wreck happened with terrifying speed. At 2:20 p.m., the power failed completely. The Yamato was now a dead hulk, rolling slowly onto her side. As the ship reached a 60-degree list, the funnels touched the water, and the massive boilers, still hot, began to explode as the cold seawater rushed into the furnace vents. This created a series of internal steam explosions that blew out the interior bulkheads, effectively opening the ship from the inside out. When the ship finally turned turtle at 2:23 p.m., she was already a shattered shell. The final magazine explosion was simply the coup de grace. The fire that had been raging in the aft 15.5 centimeters turret finally reached the main propellant stores. The resulting detonation was equivalent to several thousand tons of TNT, creating a vacuum that pulled the remains of the ship and its crew into a vortex of fire and water. The legacy of the Yamato remains a subject of intense study for naval historians and engineers alike. It represents the ultimate expression of a bygone philosophy, that size and armor could overcome any threat. However, the 386 aircraft launched by Task Force 58 proved that the horizon of naval warfare had shifted from a range of gun to the range of a flight deck. The Yamato didn't just sink. She took the entire concept of the battleship with her to the bottom of the East China Sea. Today, the debris field sits as a quiet graveyard, a testament to the 3,056 lives lost and the terrifying power of industrial-scale warfare. The destruction of the Yamato also signaled the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a functional fighting force. Following the sinking, the remaining Japanese ships, the few destroyers that survived the air attacks, picked up the handful of survivors and retreated toward Sasebo. They left behind a slick of oil that stretched for miles, a black stain on the water where the greatest battleship in history had once stood. The era of the carrier had been cemented in fire, and the Yamato became a symbol of a nation's desperate final stand. To truly understand the technical death of the Yamato, one must look at the specific engineering failures that occurred between 1:45 p.m. and 2:15 p.m., a period where the ship's internal architecture essentially declared war on its crew. Battleships of the Yamato class were built with a triple bottom and a highly sophisticated system of 1,147 watertight compartments. The theory was that even if the outer skin were pierced, the sheer volume of independent cells would keep the ship buoyant. However, the American concentrated portside tactic turned this strength into a catastrophic liability. By 1:47 p.m., the flooding on the port side had become so asymmetrical that the weight of the water was exerting thousands of tons of lateral pressure on the longitudinal bulkheads. These steel walls were designed to hold back water from the bottom, not to support the weight of the ocean pressing from the side while the ship was tilted. As the list crossed 15 degrees, a phenomenon known as free surface effect began to accelerate the ship's demise. In many of the larger compartments that were only partially flooded, the water was not static. It would slosh violently toward the port side with every roll of the ship. This shifting mass created a momentum that the ship's stabilizers could not counter. In the boiler rooms, this meant that the remaining operational furnaces were suddenly submerged in a mixture of seawater and spilled heavy fuel oil. When the cold water hit the white-hot pressurized boilers, it didn't just extinguish the fires. It caused localized steam explosions that ruptured the internal venting systems. This allowed toxic smoke and scalding steam to roar through the ventilation shafts, reaching the upper decks and killing damage control teams who were nowhere near the actual torpedo impacts. The tactical brilliance of the American assault during this window cannot be overstated. Task Force 58's air groups were not just dropping ordnance, they were performing a coordinated saturation attack. While the Avengers from USS Yorktown and USS Intrepid dropped their torpedoes from low altitudes to ensure hull breaches below the armor belt, the Helldivers were executing near-vertical dives from 10,000 feet. These dive bombers were targeting the soft spots of the Yamato, the aviation deck at the stern, and the area around the base of the funnel. A 1,000-pound bomb from a Helldiver struck the port side of the superstructure at 1:52 p.m., passing through 3 decks before exploding in the crew's galley. While this hit didn't threaten the ship's buoyancy, it shattered the internal communication lines, the voice tubes and electrical wires that connected the bridge to the engine rooms. From this moment on, Vice Admiral Itō and Captain Aruga were effectively blind, commanding a 72,000-ton giant through runners who had to navigate flooded, smoke-filled corridors. By 2 p.m., the Yamato was suffering from what naval architects call progressive flooding. This occurs when the water finds pathways through non-watertight fittings, such as electrical conduits, ventilation trunks, and even the manholes used for maintenance access. The ship was sinking by the bow and the port side simultaneously. This trim meant the ship was no longer hitting the waves head-on, but was instead plowing into them at an angle. Every time the bow dipped into a swell, hundreds of tons of seawater would wash over the deck, entering the massive 18.1-inch gun turrets through the gun ports. These turrets were designed to be weatherproof, not submersible. As water filled the turret pits, it added even more weight to the port side, creating a death spiral of increasing list and decreasing buoyancy. The psychological state of the crew during these final 20 minutes was one of disciplined despair. Records from a few survivors, such as Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, describe a scene where the unsinkable nature of the ship became a horrific irony. Because the ship was so large, the men in the lower decks didn't feel the ship sinking in the traditional sense. They felt the world slowly tilting until the bulkheads became the floor. At 2:05 p.m., the order was given to flood the starboard engine room to correct the 20-degree list. This was a suicide order for the 300 men stationed there. There was no time to evacuate them. The valves were opened, and the men were drowned in place by their own officers in a desperate, failed attempt to level the deck. Even after this sacrifice, the ship only righted itself by a few degrees before the next wave of American torpedoes struck, rendering the sacrifice moot. At 2:12 p.m., the final American torpedoes, launched by the USS Hancock's air group, struck the Yamato in the stern near the screws. This was the mobility kill. The impact bent the massive steel shaft of the outer propellers, causing them to vibrate with such intensity that they tore through their own mounting brackets. The ship's speed dropped to a crawl, barely 5 knots. With the steering gear jammed and the engines failing, the Yamato was a stationary target. The American pilots, seeing the ship was doomed, began to focus on the escorting destroyers like the Iso-Ks and Hamikes, stripping away the Yamato's last line of defense. The battleship was now an island of steel, alone in a sea of fire, slowly rolling toward its inevitable capsize. The final transition from a floating vessel to a sinking wreck began at 2:17 p.m. The list reached a critical 30 degrees. This is the point of no return for a ship of the Yamato class. Because of the high center of gravity caused by the massive armored turrets and the pagoda-style superstructure, once the ship tilted past 30 degrees, the laws of physics took over. The metacentric height, the measurement of a ship's stability, became negative. The ship was no longer trying to right itself. It was actively trying to flip over. At 2:20 p.m., the list hit 35 degrees, and the massive 18.1-inch shells in the magazines began to slide. These shells, weighing 3,219 pounds each, were stacked in racks. As the ship tilted, the locking pins sheared off under the lateral load. Thousands of tons of high-explosive ordnance began to tumble into the port-side walls of the magazines, creating sparks and friction in an environment filled with volatile propellant charges. The final explosion at 2:23 p.m. was not just a magazine fire. It was a sympathetic detonation of the entire forward and aft ammunition stores. When the ship reached nearly 90 degrees, the fire that had been smoldering in the secondary batteries since the first wave finally breached the flash-tight doors of the main magazine. The resulting blast was so immense that it created a localized atmospheric shockwave, momentarily clearing the smoke and mist for miles around. The Yamato didn't just sink. It was disintegrated from the inside out. The bow and stern sections were severed by the force of the blast, which was later estimated to be equivalent to a small tactical nuclear weapon. As the remnants of the ship descended 1,120 feet to the seafloor, they left behind a mushroom cloud that stood as a tombstone for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The era of the battleship had ended, not with a duel of guns, but with a scientific demonstration of the vulnerability of armor to the relentless, coordinated application of aerial power.